The storm had left its mark on Riverside. The small town, nestled in the foothills of North Carolina, had endured a night of relentless winds and punishing rain. Streets were submerged, creeks overflowed, and fallen trees blocked rural roads. The normally tranquil Whispering Pines forest, just outside of town, now stood dark and saturated, the weight of the storm still clinging to its branches. Emily Carter navigated cautiously along the partially flooded back road leading to her home. The wipers of her aging SUV swiped rhythmically, clearing the misty drizzle from her windshield. Though the worst had passed, the aftermath remained, a landscape of wreckage and renewal where nature's fury had carved its signature into the earth. A veterinarian for over a decade, Emily had spent the last several hours at her clinic tending to frightened pets brought in by distressed owners and assisting in a late-night surgery for a cat injured during the storm. She was exhausted but relieved to finally head home. The thought of her warm house, a steaming cup of tea, and a long, much-needed shower pulled her forward. Yet something caught her eye as she rounded a bend near the forest's edge. A cluster of black wings fluttered at the roadside, dark silhouettes perched among the skeletal remains of a broken tree. The sight made her slow down. Vultures. They were gathered in a loose circle, their hunched bodies shifting as they hopped and jostled for position. Something lay at the center of their grim assembly, half hidden by the murky water pooling in the roadside ditch. At first, Emily assumed it was just storm debris, maybe a drowned raccoon or a deer carcass swept in by the flood. But then she saw it move. Her pulse quickened. She flicked on her hazard lights and pulled to the side, gravel crunching beneath her tires. As soon as she stepped out, cold rain met her skin, a lingering remnant of the storm's wrath. The air smelled of damp earth, wet leaves, and something more acrid, something unnatural. The vultures, sensing her presence, flapped their massive wings and reluctantly lifted into the air, retreating to the overhanging branches above. Their beady eyes remained fixed below, unwilling to abandon their claim so easily. Emily ignored them, stepping carefully through the mud and bramble until she reached the source of their morbid interest. A dog, a PitBull, barely recognizable beneath the filth and blood clinging to its mottled brown and white coat. Its body trembled violently, half submerged in the frigid water, too weak to lift its head. One paw twitched feebly, a pitiful attempt at movement before it collapsed again, completely drained. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She knelt, scanning the dog's injuries with a practiced eye. Deep lacerations marred its side, its ribs jutted unnaturally beneath the soaked skin, and a strange chemical odor clung to its fur. Burn marks, likely from exposure to something toxic. A thin metal chain was still wrapped around its neck, the other end tangled in a broken tree root. Someone had left him here, abandoned, chained, left to die. Emily swallowed hard, pushing down the anger rising in her chest. This was not the time for questions or blame. The dog was barely alive, and if she didn't act now, it wouldn't be alive much longer. She reached out slowly, testing for a reaction. The PitBull's glazed eyes barely flickered toward her. No growl, no flinch, just the faintest twitch of awareness before exhaustion pulled it back into stillness. "I've got you," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. She had to get him out of here. Now Emily scanned the road. Isolated, no other cars in sight. Her SUV was parked a few yards away, the back seat already a mess of old blankets and medical supplies. It would have to do. Gritting her teeth, she took the chain in both hands and pulled. The metal links resisted, embedded deep into the mud, but after a few yanks, the tension gave way, freeing the dog from its cruel tether. He barely reacted, his body limp in her arms as she lifted him, his weight far lighter than it should have been. Malnourished, weak, on the brink. Thunder rumbled distantly, a final warning from the departing storm. Emily pressed the dog's fragile body against her chest, shielding him from the drizzle as best she could. "You're safe now," she murmured, though she knew safety was still a long way off. She climbed back into her car, placing him gently on the passenger seat, wrapping him in the dry blanket she kept in the back. His breathing was shallow, but it was still there. Emily turned the key in the ignition. The nearest emergency vet was 20 miles away. She had no idea if the PitBull would survive the ride, but she wasn't about to let him die alone in the mud. Not tonight, not if she could help it. She pressed her foot to the gas, racing against time. And as she drove through the storm-wrecked roads of Riverside, one thought clung to her mind, a name forming unspoken in the back of her consciousness. Phoenix. Because if this dog had any chance at all, he would have to rise from the ashes. Emily's heart pounded as she pressed the accelerator, her tires kicking up water from the storm-drenched road. The PitBull, no, Phoenix, lay motionless on the blanket beside her, his breath slow and uneven. She glanced at him briefly, his frail body barely rising with each breath. "Hang in there, buddy," she whispered, tightening her grip on the wheel. She needed to get to Dr. Daniel Brooks, her longtime colleague at the Riverside Veterinary Clinic, as fast as possible. It was the only clinic in town equipped to handle emergency cases, but even then the situation looked grim. Emily had treated countless animals in critical condition, but something about this dog, the cruel metal chain, the chemical burns, the sheer hopelessness in his eyes, made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. As she maneuvered through flooded streets, Emily reached for her phone and hit the hands-free call button. "Call Daniel," she commanded. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Emily, it's almost midnight. What's going on? I need you at the clinic, now." She could hear rustling as Daniel woke up fully. "I found a PitBull, bad shape. Possible malnourishment, deep lacerations, and chemical burns. I don't know how long he's been out there, but he's barely breathing." Silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "I'm on my way." "How far out are you?" 10 minutes, she said, pressing harder on the gas pedal. "Be ready." She hung up, her pulse pounding. Time was slipping through her fingers. Inside the car, Phoenix made the faintest sound, a whimper, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Emily flicked her gaze toward him, relief and worry battling in her chest. It wasn't much, but it meant he was still fighting. She didn't allow herself to consider the alternative. The fluorescent lights of the Riverside Veterinary Clinic shone like a beacon in the rain. Emily pulled into the lot, barely putting the car in park before jumping out. The door to the clinic swung open, and Daniel appeared, already pulling on his gloves. "What have we got?" he asked, his voice sharp with focus. Emily carefully lifted Phoenix from the passenger seat, cradling him against her chest. "Severely underweight, multiple wounds, possible head trauma. His breathing is weak, but he's holding on." Daniel stepped aside, and together they rushed into the exam room. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, the sound of medical equipment clicking on echoing around them. Emily laid Phoenix on the examination table, stepping back only when Daniel took over. He ran expert hands over the dog's frail body, assessing the damage. "Jesus, Emily," he muttered, pushing back Phoenix's fur to reveal the burns. Raw, inflamed patches of skin, likely caused by some kind of chemical exposure. Emily's stomach churned. I think he was abandoned before the storm. Someone left him chained to a tree in the middle of the woods. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't comment. Instead, he pulled out a syringe. "We'll start with fluids and pain management. He's dangerously dehydrated." Emily nodded, stepping forward to hold Phoenix still. As Daniel inserted the needle beneath his skin, Phoenix let out the faintest, weakest whimper. It was the first real reaction he'd given, but it made Emily's throat tighten. She placed a gentle hand on his head. "You're okay," she murmured. "We're helping you." Daniel adjusted the IV line, then moved to examine Phoenix's injuries more closely. The burns are bad, but these cuts worry me more. Some look like punctures. Could be from another animal, but they're too precise. He frowned. Could have been man-made. Emily felt a cold anger settle in her chest. She'd seen cases of animal cruelty before. Dogs used for illegal fighting, abandoned pets left to starve. But something about Phoenix's condition felt even crueler. He hadn't just been neglected. He'd been discarded. Daniel worked quickly, cleaning the wounds, applying ointment, wrapping the worst of them. "We need x-rays," he said. "I want to check for fractures, especially around that bad leg." Emily helped maneuver Phoenix onto the x-ray table, careful not to jostle him too much. The machine hummed softly, capturing images of his fragile bones. Minutes later, Daniel's face darkened as he studied the results. No fractures, but he traced a shadow on the screen with his finger. There's internal bruising, possibly from blunt force trauma. Emily's fists clenched. Someone had hurt him. She exhaled slowly, trying to push back her emotions. Right now, Phoenix needed her focused, not furious. Daniel turned to her, voice softer now. "Emily, we need to talk about what comes next." She already knew where this was going. Daniel hesitated before continuing. "He's in rough shape. Even if we get him through the night, there's no guarantee of long-term recovery. His burns will take weeks to heal, and his muscle loss is severe. If there's neurological damage from head trauma, that's a whole other battle." Emily looked at Phoenix. His breathing had evened out slightly, the IV fluids working their magic, but he was still far from stable. Daniel sighed. "I know you, Emily. I know you want to save him, but we have to be realistic. Some dogs—" His voice trailed off. "Some dogs don't make it." Emily squared her shoulders. "He's made it this far." Daniel shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he reached for a small bottle. "I'm giving him a mild sedative. Help him rest. We'll monitor him overnight." As he administered the injection, Emily reached down and brushed her fingers along Phoenix's muzzle. His eyes flickered open slightly, just for a moment. There it was again, that spark. Even in pain, even after everything, he was still here. Emily exhaled. "We're not giving up on him." Daniel gave her a long look before nodding. "All right." Hours passed in a blur of observation and care. Emily sat by Phoenix's side, monitoring his vitals, adjusting his blanket, speaking to him in soft murmurs. She didn't know if he could understand, but it felt important that he heard her voice. Outside, the storm had finally faded, leaving behind a world washed clean but scarred, just like the town, just like Phoenix. By the time dawn's light crept through the clinic windows, Phoenix was still breathing. Emily allowed herself the smallest smile. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but he had made it through the night, and that was the first step toward something new. Emily's hands trembled as she wrapped the PitBull, Phoenix, carefully in her jacket. His body was still, far too still, and his breathing was shallow. She could feel the faint warmth of his body against her chest, but it was fading fast. The storm had passed, but the battle for his life was just beginning. Her SUV was still running, the heater blasting warm air into the damp night, but it did nothing to chase away the cold sinking into her bones. She carefully laid Phoenix across the passenger seat, making sure his injured leg was positioned as comfortably as possible. His fur was still damp from the rain, the mud clinging stubbornly to his emaciated frame. Emily reached for her phone and hit the call button, her fingers slick with rain and dirt. Come on," she muttered under her breath as the phone rang. A groggy voice finally answered. "Emily, what's going on?" "Daniel, I need you at the clinic," she said. urgency tightening her voice. "I found a PitBull. Severe injuries, possible chemical burns, lacerations, and he's barely breathing. I don't know how long he's been out there." Daniel's voice sharpened instantly. "How bad?" Emily glanced at Phoenix. His sides barely moved with each breath. "Bad," she admitted. "I don't know if he's going to make it through the drive." There was a pause, then the sound of movement on the other end of the line. "I'm heading there now. Just get him here, Emily." She ended the call and tossed her phone onto the dashboard. Taking a deep breath, she reached out, gently running her fingers over Phoenix's head. His fur was coarse beneath her touch, and she could feel the ridges of his skull too prominently. "Stay with me," she murmured. "Just hold on." She threw the car into gear and peeled out onto the road, her tires splashing through standing water. The road stretched ahead, dark and slick with rain. The trees lining the highway swayed in the wind, their leaves still heavy with water. Emily kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the seat beside her, as if her touch alone could anchor Phoenix to life. Minutes ticked by, the silence in the car pressing down on her. The hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers were the only sounds filling the space between them. She stole a glance at Phoenix, afraid to see his chest still, afraid that he had slipped away without her noticing. And then it happened. A tiny movement, barely there, just a flicker. Phoenix lifted his head just a fraction of an inch and turned toward her. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion and pain, locked onto hers. His body was too weak to do much more, but somehow he found the strength to stretch his tongue just enough to lick the back of her hand. Emily's throat tightened. It was such a small thing. A weak, almost imperceptible gesture. But it was enough. "You're still in there, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Phoenix let his head rest back against the seat, his body trembling slightly from the effort. Emily swallowed past the lump in her throat and pressed harder on the gas. He was still fighting, and so was she. By the time Emily skidded into the parking lot of the Riverside Veterinary Clinic, Daniel was already outside, the door propped open. He was wearing scrubs, his hair disheveled from being roused out of bed. The second she stopped the car, he was there, yanking open the passenger door. "Let's get him inside," he said, his voice clipped and focused. Emily carefully gathered Phoenix in her arms. He was frighteningly light, his body limp but still warm. She rushed inside, Daniel right behind her, the fluorescent lights of the clinic casting an unnatural glow over everything. "Put him on the table," Daniel instructed, already snapping on latex gloves. Emily laid Phoenix down as gently as she could, but even the slight movement caused him to whimper softly. Daniel was already moving, his hands running over Phoenix's body, checking vitals, assessing the damage. "Blood pressure's dangerously low," he muttered. "He's hypothermic. We need to get fluids in him now." Emily grabbed an IV bag from the supply cabinet, moving on autopilot as Daniel prepared a catheter. They had worked together for years, long enough that they barely needed words in a situation like this. As Daniel inserted the needle into Phoenix's fragile vein, the dog let out another soft whimper. His body flinched, but he didn't have the energy to fight. Emily placed a hand on his head, her fingers running gently over his ears. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're okay." Phoenix barely reacted, but his breathing remained steady. That was something. Daniel worked quickly, flushing Phoenix's wounds, applying antiseptic, and carefully examining his burns. The chemical exposure had left deep scars along his back and legs, the skin raw and inflamed. "This wasn't an accident," Daniel said grimly. "This dog was intentionally hurt." Emily already knew that. She had seen too many cases of cruelty in her career to believe otherwise. Someone had left him out there, tied to a tree in the middle of a storm. The thought made her stomach churn. Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emily, I won't lie to you. His condition is critical, He's lost a lot of blood, and the burns, he exhaled. It's going to be a long road, if he even makes it. Emily knew the odds, but odds didn't mean anything to her right now. She looked down at Phoenix, watching as his chest rose and fell. He was still here, still breathing, still fighting. And then he did something that broke her completely. With the little strength he had left, Phoenix lifted his head, just an inch, just barely, and pressed his nose into her palm. A choice, a moment of trust. Daniel saw it too. His expression softened. Emily swallowed hard. She gently ran her fingers along the top of Phoenix's head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her touch. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I promise." For the first time since she found him, she let herself believe that he might actually survive. And Phoenix, despite the pain, despite everything, seemed to believe it too. The first few nights were the hardest. Emily had brought Phoenix home, knowing full well that the battle was far from over. The emergency treatment at the clinic had stabilized him, but his body was still weak, his injuries severe, and his future uncertain. She had set up a small makeshift recovery area in the corner of her living room, layering soft blankets over a thick dog bed to cushion his fragile frame. A heat lamp provided warmth, and a small humidifier kept the air from drying out his healing skin. Every detail mattered. Every tiny effort gave him a better chance, but no amount of preparation could ease the anxiety pressing against her ribs every time she watched his chest rise and fall, terrified that one breath might be his last. She refused to let him be alone. The first night, Emily curled up on the floor beside him, watching over him like a guardian, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing. Every few hours, she carefully dripped water onto his tongue with a syringe, whispering words of encouragement. He was too weak to drink on his own, too exhausted to even lift his head. But he swallowed, and as long as he kept fighting, so would she. A name that meant something. By the third day, Phoenix stirred for the first time since coming home. His eyes, still dull from exhaustion, fluttered open just enough to take in his surroundings. Emily was beside him instantly. "Hey there," she whispered, brushing her fingers lightly over his head. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, his golden brown eyes met hers. It was the first time he truly saw her. Not just as hands tending to his wounds, not just as the voice guiding him through the pain, but as someone who was there. Something shifted between them in that instant. "You made it through another night," she murmured, smiling softly. "You're stronger than you look. You know that?" His tail gave the slightest twitch. Emily exhaled, emotion tightening her throat. She had been thinking about it for days now, about what to call him. Something fitting, something worthy. Phoenix, a creature of fire and rebirth, one that rose from ashes and devastation to become something new. It suited him. And in that moment, as his gaze lingered on her, she swore he understood. Phoenix remained fragile, his recovery slow, but the little victories mattered. By the end of the first week, he could lift his head on his own. It was a small thing, but Emily nearly burst into tears when she walked into the room and found him awake, alert, and watching her. She immediately knelt beside him, running a hand over his head. "You're getting there," she whispered. His ears twitched slightly, his body still weak, but no longer lifeless. As the days passed, Phoenix grew stronger, painfully slowly, but surely. Emily fed him small meals throughout the day, blending his food into a liquid form that he could lap up easily. Each feeding was a delicate process, requiring patience and gentle coaxing. Some days were better than others. There were moments when his energy seemed to fade, when his body trembled too much, when he lay there panting, too weak to even respond to her touch. Those were the nights Emily sat by his side, rubbing slow circles into his fur, whispering reassurances even when doubt crept into her mind. She refused to let him feel alone. "You don't have to do this by yourself," she told him one night. "I'm here. We do this together." One morning, nearly 3 weeks after she had found him, it happened. Emily had just finished cleaning his wounds and was preparing his breakfast when she heard a rustling behind her. She turned just in time to see Phoenix shifting, his front legs pressing into the blankets, his muscles trembling from the effort. He was trying to stand. Emily froze, heart hammering as she watched him push against the ground. His back legs quivered under the weight, still too weak to fully support him, but he was trying. "Come on, buddy," she encouraged softly, not wanting to startle him. For the longest moment, he held himself up. His body wobbled, his injured leg barely cooperating. But he was standing. And then, suddenly, his legs buckled. Phoenix collapsed, hitting the blankets with a weak whimper. Emily lunged forward, her hands reaching out instinctively. Hey, it's okay," she whispered, her voice catching. She pulled him close, her arms wrapping around his frail body. His breathing was unsteady, his eyes fluttering, and for a second, she feared she had pushed him too hard. But then, he nudged his nose against her wrist. It was the smallest of gestures, but it shattered her. Emily let out a shaky breath, resting her forehead against his. "You don't have to rush," she whispered. "We'll get there." Tears burned in her eyes, but they weren't just from sadness. They were from hope, because Phoenix had tried, and that meant he wasn't giving up. From that day on, everything changed. Phoenix still struggled, still needed help, but the light in his eyes never dimmed again. He tried every day, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but always pushing forward. Emily became his constant. She was there for every stumble, every step, every small victory. She spoke to him like he understood every word because in some ways he did. She wasn't just his caretaker anymore. She was his person. And Phoenix, in turn, became her reminder of resilience, of second chances, of what it meant to fight even when the odds were against you. As she watched him that evening, curled up on his bed, his tail wagging slightly in his sleep, Emily knew one thing for certain. Phoenix wasn't just surviving. He was living, and this was only the beginning. Emily knew this moment would come. For weeks, she had poured every ounce of her energy into nursing Phoenix back to life, celebrating every small victory as if they were miracles, because in many ways, they were. The dog that had once been left for dead, battered and broken, had fought his way back, step by painful step. But now, a new battle loomed. One Emily wasn't sure she was strong enough to face. Phoenix was healing, but he would never be the same. Daniel had been the first to say it out loud, but Emily had already known. "He's come so far," Daniel admitted one afternoon as he examined Phoenix's gait, watching the dog limp unsteadily across the clinic floor. "But Emily, you have to be realistic. He's not going to recover completely." Emily's hands curled into fists. "I know that." Daniel sighed. "The burns damaged his nerves. His back leg will always be weaker. His balance is off, and we still don't know if there's lasting trauma beyond the physical." Emily swallowed hard, running her fingers through Phoenix's fur. She knew every scar by heart now, every ridge of bone that had once been hidden beneath malnourished skin. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to think about what's best for him," Daniel said gently. "He's not a stray anymore. He's your responsibility." Emily exhaled sharply. That was the problem, wasn't it? Phoenix wasn't just another rescue. He wasn't a case file to be closed. He had become something more. Daniel hesitated before adding, "You can't keep him forever, Em." She had no answer to that, because she wasn't sure she could let him go. The afternoon was unusually quiet. The sun cast long golden rays through the window, warming the wooden floor of Emily's living room. Phoenix lay curled on his bed, his breathing slow and steady, his body finally at peace after weeks of restless nights. Emily had stepped out for just an hour, the first time she had left him alone since bringing him home. She needed groceries, supplies for his care, and truthfully, a moment to clear her mind. But as she pulled into the driveway, she felt an odd sense of unease. When she opened the front door, the sight before her stole the air from her lungs. Phoenix, her Phoenix, the dog who could barely walk days ago, had dragged himself across the floor, leaving faint smudges where his paws had trembled against the hardwood. He was near the door, panting from the effort, his body visibly shaking from exhaustion. Emily dropped the bags in her hands and rushed forward. "Phoenix!" His ears twitched at her voice, his golden eyes lifting toward her with a look she had never seen before. Pure, unfiltered relief. It hit her like a punch to the chest. He had thought she wasn't coming back. He had fought through pain, through weakness, through his own failing body to reach the door. Because some part of him, no matter how much she had reassured him, still feared being abandoned again. Emily knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she ran them over his trembling body. "Oh, buddy," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." His body sagged against her, as if the last of his strength had been spent just getting close to her. And in that moment, Emily knew. Phoenix hadn't just needed to be saved. He hadn't just needed medicine, food, or a warm place to rest. He had needed someone to love him, someone who wouldn't leave. And Emily realized with startling clarity she was that person. The question had lingered in Emily's mind for weeks, unspoken but ever present. Could she keep Phoenix? She had nursed him back from the brink of death. She had seen him through his worst nights, celebrated every small victory, and built a bond that was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Letting him go felt impossible, but Daniel's words echoed in her mind. He's not a stray anymore. He's your responsibility. And responsibility meant making the right decision, even when it hurt. The call had been difficult to make, but Emily knew it was necessary. After researching options, she found a specialized search and rescue training facility that also rehabilitated dogs for emotional support roles. The program was designed for dogs that, like Phoenix, had been through trauma and could never fully return to a normal pet's life. Instead of just surviving, Phoenix could have a purpose. Emily explained his story to the director, a woman named Lisa Harding, who had spent the last 15 years training service dogs for veterans and first responders. "He's a fighter," Emily had told her. "He shouldn't just sit in a shelter or live out his days without something meaningful. I think he could help people." Lisa had agreed. With his resilience, he might be a perfect candidate for therapy work. Dogs like Phoenix, ones that have endured so much, can connect with people in ways that even trained therapists can't. It won't be easy, but if he's got the spirit, we can guide him. It was exactly what Emily had hoped for, and exactly what she had dreaded, because it meant she had to say goodbye. The morning of the transfer was bright and clear. The sky was painted in soft hues of blue, and the crisp scent of early autumn filled the air. It was a beautiful day, a cruel contrast to the way Emily's heart felt like it was shattering. Phoenix sat beside her as she packed up his things, his favorite blanket, the soft chew toy he had started playing with in the past week, the collar she had bought for him, one that he had barely worn because he had never needed a leash with her. He watched her quietly, his golden eyes filled with something she could only describe as knowing. He didn't understand the details, but he knew something was changing. The drive to the training facility was silent, except for the occasional rustle as Phoenix shifted in his seat. Normally, he liked to stick his nose out the window, but today, he stayed close to Emily, as if he didn't want to waste a single moment. She reached over and scratched behind his ears. "You're gonna do amazing things, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Phoenix sighed softly. pressing into her touch. When they arrived, Lisa was waiting outside, her warm expression reassuring but not enough to ease the ache in Emily's chest. Phoenix stepped out of the car carefully, his gait still uneven, but he held his head high. He had come so far from the trembling, broken dog she had found in the mud. Lisa crouched down, letting Phoenix sniff her hand before gently running her fingers over his scarred fur. "You're even more handsome than Emily described," she said with a smile. "And strong. I can see it in your eyes." Phoenix tilted his head slightly, considering her. Emily forced a smile. "He's got a lot of fight in him." Lisa nodded. "That's exactly what we look for." But as she reached for Phoenix's leash, he suddenly let out a soft whimper. Emily froze. Phoenix hadn't whimpered like that in weeks. Not from pain, not from fear. This was something else. She knelt beside him, cupping his face gently in her hands. "Hey, it's okay," she murmured. "You're safe. You're gonna be okay." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with the last bit of strength he had left to give her, he licked her hand. Emily's chest tightened. It was a thank you, a promise. A final gesture that said, "I understand. I trust you." Her vision blurred as she kissed the top of his head, pressing her forehead against him one last time. "I'll visit," she whispered. "Every week." I promise. Phoenix nuzzled into her for just a second longer, then stepped away. Lisa gently took his leash and led him toward the main building. Phoenix hesitated once, glancing back at Emily one final time. She lifted a hand in a silent goodbye. And then he walked forward. The house felt emptier that night. The absence of Phoenix was almost unbearable, like a missing heartbeat in the rhythm of her life. But she reminded herself, this wasn't the end of his story. Phoenix had a future, a purpose. He would go on to help others the way she had helped him. And as she sat on her porch, staring up at the endless night sky, she smiled through her tears, knowing one thing for certain. Phoenix wasn't just a survivor. He was a symbol of hope. The drive to the Riverside Canine Rehabilitation and Training Center felt different this time. A year had passed since Emily had last seen Phoenix. 365 days of wondering, of hoping, of missing him more than she thought possible. She had visited in those first few weeks, keeping her promise to check in on him. But as time passed, as he settled into his new role, she had stepped back. Not because she didn't care, but because she wanted him to truly embrace his new life. Still, today felt important. Today, she needed to see for herself. The air was crisp with the scent of autumn as she pulled into the facility's long driveway, lined with trees that had begun shedding their golden leaves. She parked near the main building, stepping out with a mix of anticipation and nervousness curling in her stomach. Would he recognize her? Would he still remember the nights she had stayed awake, holding him close as he fought for every breath? Before she could let the doubt settle too deeply, the familiar voice of Lisa Harding, the head trainer, called out to her. "Emily, you made it just in time." Emily turned to see Lisa approaching with a warm smile, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "I wouldn't miss it," Emily said, forcing a small chuckle. "It's been too long." Lisa nodded, motioning for her to follow. "Come on, I want you to see him in action." Emily followed Lisa through the facility's winding pathways, past outdoor training fields and specialized therapy rooms. The sounds of barking and distant laughter filled the air, the sounds of dogs and people healing together. And then, as they rounded a corner, she saw him. Phoenix. He stood in the center of a small, enclosed training space, his posture proud, his golden eyes no longer dulled by fear or pain, but filled with quiet strength. Beside him sat a man, a veteran, judging by the insignia on his jacket. He was hunched slightly, his hands fidgeting, his expression distant, haunted. Emily watched as Phoenix moved closer to him, gently pressing his head against the man's knee. At first, there was no reaction. But then, the man exhaled, his shoulders softening. His fingers drifted into Phoenix's fur, gripping gently like an anchor in a storm. Lisa leaned in, speaking softly. "That's Sergeant David Marks. Served 3 tours overseas. He's been struggling with PTSD for years. He doesn't talk much, doesn't let people get too close. But Phoenix..." She gestured toward the quiet moment unfolding before them. Phoenix reached him in a way no one else could. Emily swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. She had always known Phoenix was special. But seeing him like this, seeing him not as the broken dog she had rescued, but as a source of comfort, of healing, it was more than she could have ever hoped for. Lisa turned to her with a smile. "He's one of the best therapy dogs we've ever had. There's something about him, his patience, his calm. The vets here say it's like he just understands." Emily let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "He always did." As if sensing her gaze, Phoenix suddenly lifted his head and turned. For a moment, he was completely still. And then, recognition. His ears perked, his tail twitched, and before Emily could even process it, he was moving. She barely had time to kneel before he was there, pressing his head against her chest, his body trembling, not from fear, not from pain, but from excitement. "Oh, buddy," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him, burying her face into his fur. "I missed you too." Phoenix pulled back slightly, his golden eyes searching hers. And that's when she saw it. Not the desperation that had once filled them, not the fear, but something else entirely. Pride. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. He had found his place. And for the first time, Emily truly, fully believed she had made the right choice. As she sat with Phoenix in the grass stroking his fur, she glanced up at the sky. A bird circled high above, a dark silhouette against the endless blue. For a brief second, her mind flashed back to that stormy night a year ago, to the vultures that had surrounded him, waiting for the inevitable. But this wasn't a vulture. This was a hawk, soaring freely, effortlessly, a symbol, not of death, but of rebirth, just like Phoenix. Emily let out a slow breath, feeling a peace she hadn't known she needed. She would always love him. She would always be grateful for the time they had shared. But this wasn't goodbye. This was a new beginning. This heartwarming story is more than just another tale of survival. It's a testament to the power of resilience, trust, and second chances. In a world where countless dog stories focus on abandonment or loss, Phoenix's journey stands out as a beacon of hope, proving that even the most broken souls can find healing when given love and purpose. At its core, this story isn't just about a pit bull overcoming physical trauma. It's about the deep, unspoken bond between humans and animals. It's about the way they teach us patience, strength, and the ability to see beyond scars, both seen and unseen. Phoenix didn't just need to be saved. He needed to know that he mattered, that his life had meaning beyond the suffering he had endured. And in return, he gave back tenfold, offering comfort to those who, like him, had struggled to find peace. This journey reminds us that kindness can change lives, not just for animals, but for people as well. It challenges the misconceptions surrounding pit bulls, a breed too often misunderstood, showing that they are not defined by the past, but by the love and care they receive. Through Phoenix, we see that no life is beyond redemption, and that sometimes the ones we rescue end up rescuing us right back. More than just another dog story, this is a celebration of unwavering loyalty, the quiet power of trust, and the extraordinary ways that love can mend even the deepest wounds. It's a call to see the value in every life, to never turn away from those in need, and to remember that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with a single act of compassion. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.